I didn't even know what hit me until the words were already hanging in the air like poison. Honestly, Richard, your mother is becoming a financial burden we can't afford anymore. The coffee mug in my hand trembled, hot liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim as I stood frozen in the doorway of my son's gleaming kitchen in Willowbrook Heights. They hadn't seen me yet. My daughter-in-law, Cassandra, was pacing back and forth across the marble tiles, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her phone case, while my son, my Richard, sat slumped at their granite breakfast bar like a man who'd already surrendered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 7 words that would change everything. 7 words that made my chest feel like it was caving in on itself. Financial burden. Is that what 43 years of raising him had amounted to? Is that what happened when you sacrificed your own dreams, your own security, your own future, to give your child everything he needed to become the successful man sitting in this $1 million home? She's draining our emergency fund, Richard, Cassandra continued, her voice sharp with frustration. The assisted living facility, the medical bills, the physical therapy, we're hemorrhaging money. And for what? So she can sit in that expensive place and complain about the food? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. We could use that money for Bentley's private school tuition, for the house in Aspen, for investments that actually matter. My hand found the door frame, gripping it like an anchor. This was my son's home, where I'd been invited for Sunday brunch, where I'd watched my 6-year-old grandson Bentley play with his toys just an hour ago, where family photos lined the mantelpiece, including several of me holding Richard as a baby, teaching him to ride a bike, cheering at his graduation. But now I felt like an intruder listening to my own execution. "Mom's not that expensive," Richard said weakly, though his voice lacked conviction. "The insurance covers most of it." "Most isn't all," Cassandra snapped. "Do you know what we spent last month alone? $3,800. That's our vacation fund, Richard. That's Bentley's future college fund. Your mother is 71 years old. How many more years are we supposed to bleed money for someone who's just existing?" Just existing. The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought about the phone calls I made to Richard every day, asking about his work, his family, his dreams. I thought about the birthday cards I still sent with handwritten notes, the Christmas presents I saved for months to afford. The way my face lit up every time Bentley ran into my arms calling me Nana Dorothy. Was that just existing? "Maybe we could look into something more affordable," Richard said, and my heart cracked a little more. "There are state facilities." "State facilities?" Cassandra's voice pitched higher. "You want to put your mother in some government nursing home, where she'll be forgotten and neglected? Richard, think about what that would look like to our friends, to your colleagues. What would the partners at your firm think if they knew you couldn't even afford proper care for your family?" So that was it. It wasn't about the money. It was about appearances. About maintaining their perfect image while disposing of the inconvenient old woman who'd given everything to make their comfort possible. I backed away from the doorway slowly, my house slippers silent against the hardwood floor. In the living room, Bentley was building something elaborate with his Lego blocks, completely absorbed in his creation. He looked up when he saw me, his face breaking into that innocent smile that reminded me so much of Richard at that age. "Nana Dorothy, look what I made!" "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I managed, my voice somehow steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. "Absolutely wonderful." But my mind was already spinning, already calculating, already remembering things I'd tried to forget. They thought I was just a financial burden, a helpless old woman draining their resources. They had no idea what I'd walked away from, what I'd sacrificed, what I'd built before I gave it all up to raise my son. They had no idea that the woman they were so casually discarding had once been Dorothy Callahan, the youngest regional manager in Fairmont Financial's 100-year history. They didn't know about the investment portfolio I'd quietly been rebuilding, the rental properties I'd been acquiring, the business connections I'd maintained even from my retirement. They thought they were dealing with a burden. They had no idea they were about to face their worst financial nightmare.
As I kissed Bentley goodbye and told him I'd see him soon, as I hugged Richard and smiled at Cassandra like nothing had happened, I was already planning. Because if there's one thing 40 years in finance taught me, it's that revenge is a dish best served with compound interest. And Dorothy Callahan was about to teach them exactly what a real financial burden looked like. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive back to Serenity Gardens Assisted Living felt like a funeral procession. Every mile marker on Route 47 seemed to mock me, counting down the distance between my son's gleaming world and my carefully constructed prison. The steering wheel of my aging Honda Civic felt foreign under my hands, like I was piloting someone else's life back to a place I'd never chosen to be. Serenity Gardens. Even the name was a lie. There was nothing serene about watching your independence drain away one monthly payment at a time. Nothing garden-like about the sterile hallways that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. I pulled into the visitor parking. In my own temporary home, and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the brick facade that housed what everyone assumed were my final years. $3,800 a month. That's what Cassandra had said. I'd never actually calculated it myself. Never wanted to face the number that represented my complete dependence on my son's charity. But now the figure burned in my mind like a neon sign advertising my failure. How would I let this happen? How had Dorothy Callahan, who once managed portfolios worth millions, become a line item in someone else's budget? The automatic doors whooshed open, and I walked past the reception desk where Nurse Patricia waved cheerfully. "How was brunch with the family, Mrs. Callahan?" she called out, her voice bright with the forced enthusiasm that all the staff here had perfected. "Lovely," I lied, not breaking stride toward the elevator, just lovely. My apartment, Unit 4B, was exactly 650 square feet of beige carpet and cream walls. One bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchenette that was more decorative than functional, and a living area just large enough for a couch, coffee table, and the television that had become my primary companion. The monthly fee covered meals, housekeeping, basic medical care, and what they euphemistically called social activities, bingo nights and craft circles designed to keep us busy until we died. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, finally allowing my composure to crack. The tears came in waves, each one carrying a memory of what I'd given up to be here. The house in Maplewood where I'd raised Richard, sold to cover his college expenses when the scholarships fell short. The cottage in Vermont, where I'd planned to retire, liquidated to help with his law school debt. The investment account I'd built over 20 years, emptied to fund the down payment on his first home with Cassandra. Every sacrifice had felt worthwhile then. Every dollar spent on his future had been an investment in our family's legacy. But now, sitting in this sterile box that I couldn't even afford on my own, those sacrifices felt like the financial decisions of a fool. I walked to the small desk by the window and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a manila folder I hadn't touched in 3 years, the folder containing the last remnants of my former life. Bank statements showing a Social Security income of $1,847 per month. Medicare coverage that paid for some things but left gaping holes in others. A savings account with $3,200. All that remained of what had once been a substantial nest egg. The math was brutal and simple. My monthly income barely covered a quarter of the facility's fees. Without Richard's financial support, I would have exactly 43 days before I'd be forced into whatever state facility he'd mentioned so casually. The kind of place where they warehoused people like me, former somebodies who'd become financial inconveniences. But there was something else in that folder. Something I'd hidden even from myself, wrapped in a rubber band and tucked behind my insurance papers. A business card, cream-colored and expensive, with elegant script that read Wellington & Associates, Private Wealth Management. And below that, a handwritten note. "Dorothy, when you're ready to get back in the game, call me. James Wellington." James. My former colleague, my mentor, the man who tried to convince me not to liquidate everything for Richard's future. You're making a mistake, Dorothy, he'd warned. Never give away all your power. Never make yourself completely dependent on someone else's goodness. But I'd been so sure, so confident that family was the best investment of all. I turned the card over in my hands, remembering the last conversation I'd had with James 3 years ago. He'd been building something then, a new kind of investment firm that specialized in helping clients rebuild from nothing. Second chance fortunes, he'd called them. For people who've been knocked down but still have fight left in them. Did I still have fight left in me? Sitting here in my assisted living apartment, feeling every one of my 71 years, it was hard to say. But Cassandra's words echoed in my memory. Just existing. Maybe it was time to stop just existing. Maybe it was time to remind everyone exactly who Dorothy Callahan used to be. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on the card. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Wellington and Associates, James speaking. James, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. It's Dorothy Callahan. I think I'm ready to get back in the game. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then James Wellington's laugh, warm, rich, and tinged with something that sounded like relief, filled my ear. Dorothy Callahan. I was wondering when you'd finally call. His voice carried that same confidence I remembered from our days at Fairmont Financial, when we'd worked side by side building portfolios that made grown men weep with gratitude. Though I have to admit I expected it about 2 years ago. I wasn't ready 2 years ago, I said, settling into the uncomfortable chair at my tiny desk. Outside my window, other residents shuffled along the garden paths in their cardigans and comfortable shoes, moving through their predictable routines. I'm not sure I'm ready now, but staying ready doesn't seem to be an option anymore. What's the situation? James asked, his tone shifting from friendly to professional. It was a voice I remembered well, the same one he'd used when clients came to him desperate, broken, and looking for financial salvation. I told him everything. The conversation I'd overheard, Cassandra's casual dismissal of my worth, Richard's weak protests and easy capitulation. I told him about the $3,800 a month, about the state facility threats, about sitting in my son's kitchen like a ghost haunting my own irrelevance. James listened without interruption, the way he'd always been good at doing. So, he said when I finished, you want revenge. I want independence, I corrected, though we both knew they were the same thing. I want to never again sit in someone else's house listening to them discuss my disposal like I'm a broken appliance. Fair enough. What assets do we have to work with? I opened my folder and read him the brutal numbers. Social Security, Medicare, the pitiful savings account. It sounded even worse when spoken aloud. That's your obvious money, James said dismissively. What about the money they don't know about? There is no other money, James. I gave everything to Richard. Dorothy, his voice carried a note of gentle reproach. In all the years I've known you, you've never put all your eggs in one basket. It's not in your nature. So let me ask again, what money don't they know about? I closed my eyes, remembering. There had been something, one small account I'd opened years ago and then forgotten about during the chaos of Richard's wedding and my move to assisted living. A modest investment in a tech startup that James had recommended, something called Cloud Vault Solutions. I'd put in $5,000 as a favor to him, then promptly forgotten about it when the company went quiet for 2 years. Cloud Vault, I said slowly. I think I still have some shares in Cloud Vault Solutions. James's sharp intake of breath was audible. Dorothy, please tell me you didn't sell those shares. I forgot I had them. Why? Cloud Vault was acquired by Microsoft 18 months ago. Your $5,000 investment is now worth approximately $470,000. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the desk. $470,000. I scrambled to pick up the phone, my hand shaking. Are you certain? I whispered. Dead certain. I've been managing the account as a favor. Figured you'd call eventually. The acquisition payout has been sitting in a high-yield growth fund, accruing interest. With dividends and market gains, you're actually sitting closer to $520,000 now. $520,000. More money than I'd seen in one place since I'd liquidated everything for Richard's future. Enough money to change everything. James, I need to see you. In person. Today. I'm in Hartford, about 90 minutes from you. Can you drive? I looked at my car keys sitting on the counter. When was the last time I'd driven anywhere besides Richard's house or the grocery store? When had I stopped thinking of myself as someone who went places and did things? Yes, I said firmly, I can drive. Good. But Dorothy, before you come down here, you need to understand something. If we're going to do this, if we're really going to rebuild your financial independence, we can't do it halfway. You can't feel guilty about outmaneuvering your son and his wife. You can't have second thoughts when they start feeling the pressure. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Cassandra's dismissive tone, about Richard's passive acceptance of my disposal, about the phrase just existing that had cut me deeper than any physical wound. James, my son thinks I'm a burden. His wife thinks I'm a drain on their resources. They're planning to warehouse me in some state facility so they can afford a vacation home. My voice grew stronger with each word. I spent 43 years making sure Richard had every advantage, every opportunity. I gave up my own security to build his. And now they want to discard me like a used appliance. So that's a yes? That's a yes. But James, I don't want to destroy them. I want to teach them. I want them to understand exactly what they tried to throw away. Understood. And Dorothy? Bring everything you have on their financial situation. Property records, tax documents, any business information about Richard's law firm. If we're going to play this game, we need to know the field. After I hung up, I sat in my chair for a long moment, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. For the first time since moving into Serenity Gardens, I had somewhere to go, something to do. A purpose beyond waiting for the next meal or the next scheduled activity. I gathered the financial documents I'd need, including some information about Richard's law firm that I'd collected over the years out of motherly interest. Then I changed clothes, trading my comfortable cardigan for a blazer I hadn't worn in months, and walked to the parking garage with something approaching my old confident stride. As I started the Honda and pulled onto Route 47, heading toward Hartford, I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 3 years, Dorothy Callahan looked like she was going somewhere that mattered. The game was about to begin. The Wellington and Associates building rose from Hartford's financial district like a glass and steel monument to ambition. 23 floors of gleaming chrome and tinted windows, with the kind of understated elegance that whispered rather than shouted about the wealth flowing through its halls. I handed my keys to the valet. When had I last been somewhere that had valet parking? And walked through the marble lobby with my chin up and my shoulders back. The elevator carried me to the 19th floor in smooth silence, and when the doors opened, I stepped into a world I'd almost forgotten existed. Rich burgundy carpets, oil paintings that weren't prints, the subtle hum of serious money being seriously managed. The receptionist, a polished young woman with the kind of professional smile that cost extra, looked up as I approached. "Mrs. Callahan, Mr. Wellington is expecting you. Right this way, please." James's office overlooked the Connecticut River, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the space feel like it was floating above the city. He stood when I entered, and I was struck by how little he'd changed. Still tall and lean, still wearing suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary, still carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd never doubted his own worth. "Dorothy." He came around the desk and embraced me warmly. "You look exactly the same." "Liar," I said, but I was smiling, though I appreciate the effort. "Sit, please. Coffee? Something stronger?" "Coffee's fine." I settled into one of the leather chairs facing his desk, placing my manila folder on the side table. "James, before we go any further, I need to know this is real. The Cloud Vault money. It's actually mine?" He turned his computer monitor toward me, and there it was, an account statement with my name at the top and a balance that made my eyes water. $547,382.16 as of yesterday's close. "It's real," he confirmed, pouring coffee from an expensive-looking carafe. "And it's been real for 18 months. I've been wondering when you'd surface to claim it." I stared at the number, feeling something shift inside my chest. It wasn't just the money, though God knew the money changed everything. It was what the money represented, proof that Dorothy Callahan still existed, that somewhere beneath the assisted living resident and the financial burden, was a woman who'd made smart investments and built something valuable. Now, James continued, settling behind his desk, tell me about the revenge. I told you, it's not revenge, it's education. Dorothy, I've known you for 15 years. When you get that look in your eyes, it's revenge. The question is whether it's the smart kind or the stupid kind. I opened my folder and spread the documents across his desk. Richard's mortgage information, which I'd helped him navigate 5 years ago. Property tax records for the house in Willowbrook Heights. Business registration for his law firm partnership. Insurance documents. Even some financial statements he'd shared with me during a moment of father-son bonding 2 years ago. James studied the papers with the intense focus I remembered from our Fairmont days. Interesting, he murmured, making notes on a legal pad. Very interesting indeed. What do you see? I see a young couple who've leveraged themselves to the absolute limit, he said, looking up at me. The house is worth about $2 million, but they owe $1.7 on the mortgage. The law firm is profitable, but not spectacularly so. Richard's pulling in maybe $300,000 a year before taxes. Cassandra doesn't work, from what I can see here. She's a full-time socialite, I said dryly. Very demanding profession. I'm sure. But here's what's really interesting. They've been using home equity lines of credit to maintain their lifestyle. Big ones. And Richard's firm just took on some major expansion debt to bring in 2 new partners. I leaned forward. Meaning, they're cash poor, despite appearing wealthy. Most of their net worth is tied up in the house and the business, and both of those are heavily mortgaged. They're living paycheck to paycheck, just like someone making $50,000 a year, except their baseline expenses are exponentially higher. The picture was becoming clearer. So when they're paying my assisted living fees, they're probably borrowing against the house to do it, which means they're not just paying $3,800 a month for your care. They're paying $3,800 plus interest, compounded over 30 years. James smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. No wonder Cassandra's getting nervous. But they don't have to pay for my care anymore, I said slowly. Not if I can pay for it myself. You could do more than pay for it yourself. With this kind of money, properly invested, you could upgrade to the luxury wing at Serenity Gardens. Or move somewhere even nicer. You could hire private nurses, travel, buy a condo if you wanted. The possibilities spread out before me like a banquet I'd forgotten existed. But something else was taking shape in my mind, something more elegant than simple independence. James, what if I didn't just stop being their burden? What if I became their solution? He raised an eyebrow. Go on. They're cash poor but asset rich. I'm liquid rich but looking for investments. What if Dorothy Callahan became their private lender? James sat back in his chair, and I could see him working through the implications. You want to loan them money? I want to buy their debt, I corrected. The home equity lines, the business loans, maybe even negotiate to hold the mortgage. Instead of owing various banks and institutions, they'd owe me. At what interest rate? I smiled, feeling my old instincts awakening. Whatever rate I choose to set. The silence stretched between us, and then James began to laugh. Dorothy Callahan, you beautiful, vindictive woman. You don't want revenge. You want control. I want security, I said. I want to never again be at the mercy of someone else's financial decisions. And if Richard and Cassandra learn some humility along the way, well, that's just good parenting. This is complicated, James warned. We'd need to set up shell corporations, private lending entities, probably move the money through several accounts to keep your name off the initial paperwork. It'll take time. How much time? 6 weeks? Maybe 8 if we want to do it right. I thought about sitting in my beige apartment for another 2 months, listening to Cassandra and Richard discuss my future like I wasn't even human. Let's do it right, I said. But James, I want to start immediately. Understood. But Dorothy, once we pull this trigger, there's no going back. You'll be playing in the big leagues again, with all the risks that entails. I looked out the window at the city spread below us, at the world of power and money and influence that I'd walked away from to raise my son. I've been playing it safe for 3 years, I said. Look where it got me. James reached across the desk and shook my hand. Welcome back to the game, Dorothy. The transformation began immediately, though no one at Serenity Gardens would have recognized it as such. To them, I was simply Mrs. Callahan returning from an unusually long day trip, nodding politely to the evening staff as I made my way to the elevator. But inside my beige apartment, everything had changed. I spread James's preliminary paperwork across my small dining table, incorporation documents for 3 shell companies, loan application templates, financial assessment forms that would let us peer into every corner of Richard and Cassandra's leveraged lifestyle. The familiar weight of serious business settled over my shoulders like a coat I'd forgotten I owned. The first challenge was intelligence gathering, and I had advantages my targets couldn't imagine. 43 years of being Richard's mother had given me access to information that no legitimate lender would ever possess. I knew about his college roommate who defaulted on a personal loan. I knew about the credit card debt he'd hidden from Cassandra during their engagement. Most importantly, I knew about his pride, the towering, fragile ego that would make him vulnerable to exactly the right kind of approach. Over the next week, I maintained my regular schedule with surgical precision. Sunday brunch at Richard's house, where I smiled and nodded through Cassandra's increasingly pointed comments about assisted living costs. Monday afternoon phone calls to check on Bentley's school progress. Wednesday grocery runs to the Whole Foods near their neighborhood, where I began to document their spending patterns with the methodical attention of a private investigator. "Nana Dorothy!" Bentley had shouted the previous Sunday, running into my arms with his usual enthusiasm. "Mom says we might move to a bigger house with a pool." "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," I'd replied, while mentally noting that they were already shopping for upgrades they couldn't afford. Cassandra's smile had been strained as she'd corrected him. "We're just looking, Bentley. Nothing's decided." But I'd seen the real estate brochures on their counter. Houses in Fairfield County starting at $3 million. Properties that would require them to leverage every asset they possessed and probably borrow against Richard's future earnings. The kind of financial overextension that would make them desperate for creative solutions. James called me Thursday evening with the first piece of good news. "North Star Capital Solutions is officially incorporated," he said, referring to the primary shell company we'd established. "Clean credit history, excellent references, and completely untraceable to Dorothy Callahan. We're ready to start making inquiries." "What kind of inquiries?" "The kind that will give us a complete picture of their financial situation. Property assessments, credit reports, business valuations. By next week, we'll know more about their money than they do." While James worked his magic with corporate paperwork and financial investigations, I had a different kind of homework. I needed to relearn the woman I'd been before I became someone's burden. That meant hours in my apartment, reading financial journals I'd ignored for years, studying market trends and investment strategies, rebuilding the mental muscles that had once made me formidable. The hardest part was the waiting. Every interaction with Richard and Cassandra felt like a performance now, smiling through their casual dismissals while knowing I held the power to change everything. During one particularly difficult conversation, Cassandra had actually patted my hand sympathetically, while explaining that people our age needed to be realistic about our limitations. "Of course, dear," I'd said, my voice steady as granite. "Realism is so important." If only she knew how realistic I was being. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning, when James called with barely contained excitement. "Dorothy, we hit the jackpot. Richard's firm just submitted applications for a $2 million expansion loan. They want to buy out a smaller practice and merge the client lists. And they're getting rejected everywhere. The debt-to-income ratios are too high, the collateral is already overextended, and the market's getting tighter for speculative business loans. They're desperate." I felt my pulse quicken. How desperate? Desperate enough to consider private lending at above-market rates. I've already had North Star Capital reach out through intermediaries, expressing interest in commercial real estate and professional practice loans. Have they responded? Richard's partner called back within 2 hours. They want to meet. This was it. The moment when Dorothy Callahan stopped being a victim and became a player again. "Set up the meeting," I said. "But James, I need to be there." "Dorothy, that's risky. If Richard sees you." "He won't see me. I'll be Barbara North, Senior Investment Advisor for North Star Capital. Can you make that work?" The silence on the other end told me James was thinking through the complications. It'll require some creative documentation, but yes, we can create a professional identity that'll hold up to casual scrutiny. Then do it. I want to look my son in the eye when he begs for money he doesn't know is mine. By Friday, Barbara North existed on paper and in practice. James's people had worked miracles: driver's license, professional credentials, even a LinkedIn profile with a carefully curated work history. I spent hours in front of my bathroom mirror, practicing the subtle changes that would make me unrecognizable. My gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, glasses I didn't need, makeup applied with a heavier hand than usual. A charcoal business suit that James had messengered to me, expensive enough to command respect, but conservative enough to suggest serious money. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning at Richard's law firm. As I stood in my apartment Sunday night, preparing for the performance of my lifetime, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror. Barbara North stared back at me, confident, prosperous, completely in control. For a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was I going too far? Was this revenge masquerading as justice? But then I remembered Cassandra's voice. Just existing. I remembered Richard's passive acceptance of my disposal. I remembered sitting in that kitchen, feeling invisible and worthless while they planned my future without my input. No, this wasn't going too far. This was going exactly far enough. Tomorrow, I would walk into my son's office as a stranger with money he desperately needed. Tomorrow, Dorothy Callahan would begin teaching them the most expensive lesson of their lives. And the beautiful part was, they would thank me for it. The law offices of Miller, Harrison & Associates occupied the third floor of a renovated colonial building in downtown Westfield, all exposed brick and polished hardwood that screamed understated success. I arrived 15 minutes early, giving myself time to study the environment where my son had built his professional life. The receptionist, a young woman with the eager efficiency of someone still proving herself, offered me coffee and directed me to a conference room with windows overlooking the town square. At exactly 10 o'clock, Richard walked in with his partner, David Harrison, and I experienced a moment of pure maternal pride, followed immediately by a stab of something much more complex. My son looked every inch the successful attorney. Tailored navy suit, confident handshake, the kind of practiced smile that had probably closed 1,000 deals. But I could see the tension around his eyes, the slight tightness in his jaw that I recognized from his childhood whenever he was trying to solve a problem beyond his capabilities. "Miss North, thank you for coming," Richard said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, professional, and he looked directly into my eyes without the faintest flicker of recognition. 3 years of assisted living had aged me more than I'd realized, but the transformation I'd undergone was more than physical. Barbara North carried herself with an authority that Dorothy Callahan had forgotten she possessed. "Mr. Miller, Mr. Harrison," I replied, my voice pitched slightly lower than usual, carrying the crisp consonants of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I understand you have an interesting proposition for North Star Capital." David Harrison, a heavy-set man with silver hair and nervous energy, launched into their presentation with the desperation of someone who'd already heard too many rejections. They wanted to acquire Pemberton & Sons, a smaller firm specializing in estate planning, merge the client lists, and expand their commercial real estate practice. The numbers were ambitious: $2 million in acquisition costs, another $500,000 for office renovation and staff expansion. "The market analysis supports significant growth potential," Richard added, sliding a bound proposal across the conference table. "Commercial development in this area is accelerating, and estate planning services are always in demand." I studied their documents with the careful attention of someone whose money was at stake, making occasional notes on a legal pad. The proposal was actually quite good, well-researched, professionally presented, with realistic projections and contingency planning. Under different circumstances, it would have been exactly the kind of investment opportunity that made sense. "Your business plan is impressive," I said finally. "But I noticed some significant gaps in your financial documentation. Your debt-to-income ratios suggest you're already highly leveraged." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We've had some temporary cash flow challenges, but our revenue streams are solid. The expansion will actually improve our overall financial position." Temporary challenges, I repeated, allowing a note of skepticism to enter my voice. Mr. Miller, I've reviewed your credit applications with 3 other institutions. All rejected. What makes you think North Star Capital should take a risk that Chase, Bank of America, and First National wouldn't touch? The question hit its target. David Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Richard's professional composure began to show cracks. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, when desperation would override pride, when my successful attorney son would reveal just how badly he needed help. Ms. North, Richard said carefully, traditional lenders are constrained by federal regulations and conservative risk assessment models. Private capital partners have more flexibility to see the bigger picture. That's a diplomatic way of saying you're willing to pay above market rates for money no one else will give you, I replied. What kind of terms are you prepared to accept? The negotiation that followed was brutal and beautiful. I watched my son, this man I'd raised to be strong and capable, gradually surrender every advantage he thought he possessed. When David suggested 8% interest, I countered with 12. When they proposed a 5-year term, I insisted on 3 years with balloon payments. When they offered the business as collateral, I demanded personal guarantees backed by their homes. 12% seems excessive, Richard said, his professional mask slipping enough to reveal frustration underneath. Mr. Miller, I replied, leaning back in my chair with the casual confidence that only comes with holding all the cards. You've been turned down by every legitimate lender in the state. North Star Capital specializes in high-risk investments that traditional institutions won't touch. High risk commands high returns. If 12% seems excessive, perhaps you should reconsider whether you're ready for this level of expansion. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. I could see Richard weighing his options, calculating the cost of accepting my terms against the cost of abandoning his dreams. David Harrison looked like he was about to be sick. Finally, Richard spoke. What kind of timeline are we looking at for a decision? Our investment committee meets weekly, I said, improvising smoothly. I can present your proposal this Friday, but I'll need complete financial disclosure from both partners. Personal tax returns for the last 3 years, property assessments, detailed business account statements, and comprehensive debt schedules. That's quite extensive, David protested. Mr. Harrison, I said, fixing him with the kind of stare that had once made junior analysts tremble. You're asking me to recommend a $2.5 million investment in a firm that's already been rejected by every conventional lender. Extensive due diligence isn't a request. It's a requirement. Richard nodded slowly. We can provide that documentation. Excellent. One more thing. I'll need to visit your primary collateral properties. Professional assessment of the assets we'd be securing against. You want to inspect our homes? David's voice pitched higher with surprise. I want to inspect every asset you're offering as collateral, yes. If we're going to hold mortgages on your properties, we need to understand exactly what we'd be acquiring in the event of default. The word default hung in the air like a threat, which of course it was. I watched Richard's face carefully, looking for any sign that he understood what he was walking into. But all I saw was determination mixed with desperation. A man so focused on the prize that he couldn't see the trap closing around him. We scheduled the property inspections for the following week, and I promised a decision by the end of the month. As I gathered my papers and prepared to leave, Richard stood and offered his hand again. Ms. North, I appreciate North Star's consideration. This expansion will transform our practice. I'm sure it will, Mr. Miller, I replied, meeting his eyes one last time. Transformation is exactly what we're in the business of providing. Walking out of that building, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The intoxicating rush of absolute power. In less than an hour, I had maneuvered my son and his partner into a position where they would soon owe me everything. Their business, their homes, their financial futures, all of it would belong to Dorothy Callahan, though they'd never know her name. The game was no longer just beginning. I was already winning. The property inspection was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and I spent the preceding days in a state of anticipation so intense it bordered on euphoria. Barbara North would be walking through my son's house. The same house where I'd sat in that kitchen listening to them discuss my disposal like yesterday's garbage. The irony was so perfect it felt like divine intervention. I arrived at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive in a black Lincoln Continental that James had arranged, complete with a driver who understood the importance of maintaining my professional facade. The house looked even more impressive from the perspective of a potential creditor. $2.1 million of Georgian colonial perfection, with its manicured lawn, circular driveway, and the kind of architectural details that whispered old money even when purchased with new debt. Richard met me at the front door, and I had to suppress a smile at his obvious nervousness. He'd changed into what he probably thought was casual wear, khakis, and a polo shirt that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. But his anxiety was written in the stiff set of his shoulders and the way he kept checking his watch. "Ms. North, welcome to our home," he said, gesturing for me to enter. "Cassandra's out with our son, but she'll be back shortly." Perfect. I wanted to see Cassandra's reaction when Barbara North evaluated their lifestyle with the cold precision of a loan officer. "I appreciate you accommodating my schedule, Mr. Miller. These assessments are routine, but necessary." The interior was exactly what I'd expected from Cassandra's taste. Expensive, trending, and utterly without personality. Restoration hardware furniture arranged with magazine precision, abstract art that looked expensive because it was expensive, and not a single item that suggested actual human beings lived here. It was a showcase, not a home, which explained a great deal about their financial priorities. I moved through the rooms with methodical precision, taking notes on a clipboard and occasionally photographing details with a professional-grade camera. Square footage, architectural features, recent renovations, anything that would affect the property's value in the event of foreclosure. Richard followed at a respectful distance, offering information when I asked, and staying silent when I didn't. "The kitchen was completely renovated 2 years ago," he mentioned, as we entered the space where I'd learned exactly what my son and daughter-in-law thought of me. Italian marble countertops, custom cabinetry, professional-grade appliances. "I can see that," I replied, running my hand along the granite surface where I'd set my coffee mug during that devastating conversation. "Approximately how much did you invest in the renovation?" "Around $90,000, including the breakfast nook expansion." $90,000. More than twice my annual Social Security income, spent on a kitchen that already functioned perfectly well. I made a note on my clipboard while mentally calculating how many months of assisted living care that renovation had cost. "And this was financed through your home equity line of credit?" Richard's hesitation told me everything I needed to know, partially yes. We continued through the house, and with each room I built a more complete picture of their financial recklessness. The master bedroom suite with its marble bathroom and custom walk-in closet. Bentley's room, which contained enough toys to stock a small store. The home office where Richard handled his practice's finances, complete with built-in bookcases and a desk that probably cost more than my car. But it was the basement that provided the most revealing discovery. Richard had converted it into an entertainment space. Full bar, leather sectional seating, enormous television, and a wine cellar that contained at least $50,000 worth of collectible bottles. "This is quite impressive," I said, genuinely admiring the craftsmanship while internally calculating the cost. "Recent addition?" "Last year. We do a lot of entertaining for the firm's clients." I nodded, making notes about the built-in wet bar and temperature-controlled wine storage. Business entertaining can be an excellent investment. At that moment, we heard the front door open and Cassandra's voice calling out, "Richard, is the inspection lady still here?" Inspection lady. Even from a distance, Cassandra's dismissive tone was unmistakable. Richard's face flushed slightly with embarrassment. "In here," he called back, and moments later Cassandra appeared at the top of the basement stairs with Bentley beside her. I'd forgotten how stunning my daughter-in-law was. Tall, blonde, with the kind of effortless elegance that came from never having worried about money. She wore a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly assisted living allowance, and her smile was warm but calculated, the expression of someone accustomed to charming her way through any situation. "You must be Ms. North," she said, descending the stairs with practiced grace. "I'm Cassandra Miller. I hope Richard's been taking good care of you." "He has indeed. You have a beautiful home." "Thank you. We've put a lot of love into it." Her eyes swept over my professional attire and clipboard, clearly assessing whether I was someone worth impressing. "Richard tells me you're considering an investment in the firm's expansion." "I'm conducting due diligence for my investors," I replied carefully. "Property assessment is standard procedure for secured lending." Bentley, who had been hanging back behind his mother, suddenly perked up with 6-year-old directness. "Are you going to give Daddy money?" "Bentley," Cassandra said quickly, her cheeks coloring slightly, "why don't you go upstairs and start your homework?" But I was already kneeling down to Bentley's level, my heart aching at seeing my grandson up close while wearing the mask of a stranger. "That's a very smart question," I told him. "What do you think? Should we loan your daddy money for his business?" "I guess so," Bentley said with the seriousness that children bring to adult conversations. "Mommy says we need money for a bigger house with a pool." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went pale, while Cassandra looked like she wanted to disappear into the expensive hardwood flooring. "Bentley, honey, why don't you go play in your room?" Cassandra said, her voice tight with forced cheerfulness. After he'd bounded up the stairs, she turned to me with an apologetic smile. "Children say the darndest things. You know how it is."
"Of course," I replied, standing and smoothing my skirt. "Though it does raise an interesting question about your debt-to-income projections if you're simultaneously considering additional real estate purchases." Richard jumped in quickly. "We're not actively house hunting. Bentley just overheard us discussing future possibilities." "Future possibilities that would require additional financing," I observed, making another note on my clipboard. The remainder of the inspection passed in uncomfortable silence, with Cassandra maintaining her hostess smile while clearly wishing I would leave. As I gathered my materials and prepared to go, she made one final attempt at charm. "Ms. North, I hope you'll give serious consideration to Richard's proposal. He's built something really special with this firm, and the expansion will benefit so many families in our community." "I'm sure it will," I replied, meeting her eyes directly. "Community benefit is always a consideration in our investment decisions." As my driver pulled away from Maple Ridge Drive, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The inspection had been even more revealing than I'd hoped. Not only had I confirmed their financial overextension, but I'd seen firsthand how they lived, how they spent, how casually they discussed money they didn't have while sitting on assets they couldn't afford. Most importantly, I'd looked into Cassandra's eyes while she begged me to loan her husband money that would soon give me control over every aspect of their comfortable, careless lives. The financial burden was about to become their financial nightmare, and they were going to thank me for the privilege. The investment committee meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at Wellington & Associates, though of course there was no actual committee, just James and me, sitting in his conference room with coffee and croissants, playing out the final act of our elaborate charade. I'd returned to being Dorothy Callahan for this meeting, trading Barbara North's severe business suit for my comfortable cardigan and sensible shoes. "The property assessment confirms everything we suspected," I told James, spreading photographs across the mahogany table. "They're living completely beyond their means. The house alone has been leveraged to 90% of its value, and that's before accounting for the recent renovations." James studied the images with professional interest. "What's your read on their psychological state?" "Desperate, but trying to hide it. Richard's maintaining his lawyer facade, but I could see the stress fractures. And Cassandra." I paused, remembering her forced smile and the way she'd tried to charm Barbara North. "Cassandra's scared. She's built her entire identity around being the successful attorney's wife, and she can sense it's all starting to crumble." "Perfect. Desperation makes people malleable." James pulled out a thick folder. "I've prepared the loan documents. $2.5 million at 12% annually, 3-year term with personal guarantees from both partners. If they default, which they will, given their current burn rate, we can move to foreclose on both their homes and seize the business assets." I opened the folder and reviewed the contract language. It was beautifully crafted, dense with legal terminology that would obscure the true implications until it was too late. Hidden within the standard boilerplate were provisions that would give North Star Capital extraordinary power over Miller, Harrison, and Associates. Approval rights for major expenditures, quarterly financial reporting requirements, the ability to call the loan due immediately if certain performance metrics weren't met. This is more than predatory lending, I observed. This is a complete takeover disguised as a business loan. That's exactly what it is. And the beautiful part is, they'll sign it willingly because they have no other choice. My phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. Ms. North, wondering if there's any update on the investment committee's decision. We're eager to move forward. They're getting anxious, I said, showing James the message. Good. Let them sweat over the weekend. Monday morning, Barbara North will call with the good news. But as I sat in James's conference room, looking at the documents that would give me absolute control over my son's financial future, something unexpected happened. A flutter of doubt, small but persistent, began to gnaw at the edges of my satisfaction. This was Richard, my baby boy who'd cried when he couldn't solve math homework in 3rd grade. The teenager who'd called me at midnight from college, homesick and overwhelmed. The young man who'd held my hand at his father's funeral and promised he'd always take care of me. James, I said slowly, what happens to Bentley in all this? Bentley?
My grandson. Richard's son. When we foreclose on their house, when we destroy their financial security, what happens to that 6-year-old boy? James leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from business partner to old friend. Dorothy, I wondered when you'd ask that question. And? The beauty of this arrangement is that you'll control the timeline. You can choose to be merciful or merciless, depending on how they behave. If Richard and Cassandra learn their lesson, if they show proper respect and gratitude, you can restructure the terms. If they don't, he shrugged. Well, that's their choice to make. I thought about Bentley's bright smile, his excitement about showing me his Lego creations, the way he called me Nana Dorothy, with such pure affection. He had no idea that his comfortable world was about to become a battleground between his parents and his grandmother. There's something else, I said. Something I need to tell you before we proceed. James raised an eyebrow. I don't want to destroy them, I want to own them. The words came out more clearly than I'd expected, crystallizing thoughts that had been forming since the property inspection. I want Richard and Cassandra to understand that their comfortable life, their beautiful house, their social status, all of it exists at my discretion. I want them to know that the financial burden they tried to discard is now their financial lifeline. That's actually more sophisticated than simple revenge, James said approvingly. You're talking about long-term psychological control rather than one-time punishment. Exactly. They'll make their loan payments, maintain their lifestyle, continue being the perfect couple in Willowbrook Heights. But every month, they'll write a check to North Star Capital, never knowing they're paying their despised mother-in-law for the privilege of staying afloat. James was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. It's brilliant, he said finally. Absolutely brilliant. But, Dorothy, maintaining that level of deception long-term, it's going to require incredible discipline. You can never let the mask slip, never give them a hint that Barbara North and Dorothy Callahan are the same person. I understand. And you'll need to continue living at Serenity Gardens, maintaining your role as the aging dependent they're trying to dispose of. Can you do that? Can you sit through Sunday dinners, listening to them discuss loan payments and financial stress, knowing you're the cause of it all? I thought about that for a long time. Could I maintain the performance indefinitely? Could I sit across from Richard at family dinners, accepting his charity and his pity, while secretly controlling every aspect of his financial future? Yes, I said finally, I can do that. Then we proceed Monday morning? I looked once more at the loan documents, at the legal language that would transform Dorothy Callahan from victim to puppet master. We proceed Monday morning. That weekend passed with agonizing slowness. I maintained my regular routine at Serenity Gardens. Saturday morning craft circle, Sunday brunch with Richard and Cassandra, evening telephone calls with distant relatives who still thought of me as someone's sweet, helpless mother. But underneath the surface, I was vibrating with anticipation. Sunday's brunch was particularly excruciating. Cassandra was unusually solicitous, asking about my health, my comfort at the facility, whether I needed anything. Richard seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly and making excuses to step outside for business calls that were obviously anything but. "Mom," he said during one of our private moments, "I want you to know that whatever happens with the firm's expansion, we'll always make sure you're taken care of." "That's very sweet, dear," I replied, patting his hand with maternal affection while internally calculating the interest he'd soon be paying me. As I drove back to Serenity Gardens that evening, I felt the weight of what I was about to unleash. By Tuesday, Richard and Cassandra would have signed documents that put their entire financial future in my hands. They would celebrate their good fortune, toast their success, plan their bright future, never knowing that their salvation was also their chains. The financial burden was about to become their financial master, and they would never see it coming. Monday morning arrived with the crisp promise of autumn, and I woke before dawn with the kind of nervous energy I hadn't felt since my early days at Fairmont Financial. Today, Barbara North would make the call that would change everything. I dressed carefully in my assistant living uniform, comfortable slacks, soft cardigan, the kind of unremarkable clothing that made me invisible to anyone under 60, then drove to a small cafe 20 miles from Serenity Gardens, where I could make the call in complete privacy. At exactly 9 o'clock, I dialed Richard's office number, my voice already transformed into Barbara North's crisp, professional tone. "Mr. Miller? This is Barbara North from North Star Capital. I have news about your loan application." The sharp intake of breath on the other end was audible. "Ms. North, thank you for calling. We've been anxiously waiting to hear from you. The investment committee met Friday afternoon, and I'm pleased to inform you that we're prepared to move forward with your request. However, there are specific terms and conditions that must be met." I could hear him covering the phone, probably signaling to David Harrison that the call had come through. "That's wonderful news. What kind of terms are we looking at?" I outlined the conditions with methodical precision. 12% annual interest, compounded monthly, 3-year term with balloon payment due in full at maturity, personal guarantees from both partners, secured by their primary residences, quarterly financial reporting requirements. Most importantly, a provision that would allow North Star Capital to call the loan due immediately if the firm's monthly revenues fell below specific thresholds. "The interest rate is higher than we'd hoped," Richard said carefully, "but given the current market conditions, we understand the premium for private capital." "Mr. Miller, I want to be absolutely clear about what you're agreeing to. This is not a traditional business loan. North Star Capital will essentially become a silent partner in your firm's operations, with significant oversight rights and the ability to intervene if performance doesn't meet our standards." "We're confident in our business model," Richard replied, though I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "When can we review the documentation?" "The contracts will be delivered this afternoon. Assuming you're satisfied with the terms, we can close by Friday." After I hung up, I sat in the cafe for another hour, drinking coffee and watching ordinary people go about their ordinary Monday morning routines. None of them knew that Dorothy Callahan had just taken the first step toward financial revenge that would reshape her family's entire future. The rest of the week passed in a carefully orchestrated dance of deception. As Dorothy Callahan, I maintained my regular schedule at Serenity Gardens, attending the Tuesday afternoon book club and Thursday morning exercise class. But my real attention was focused on the parallel drama playing out in Richard's world, where Barbara North's loan documents had arrived and were being scrutinized by the firm's attorney. James called me Wednesday evening with an update. "They're getting cold feet about some of the oversight provisions," he reported. "Their lawyer is raising red flags about the quarterly reporting requirements and the revenue threshold clauses." "What did you tell them?" "That North Star Capital has very specific standards for high-risk investments, and these provisions are non-negotiable. If they're not comfortable with the terms, we have other opportunities to pursue." "And?" Richard called back 2 hours later and said they were prepared to move forward. Thursday brought another test of my resolve. During my regular phone call with Richard, he mentioned the loan approval but seemed subdued rather than celebratory. It's good news about the expansion funding, I said, making my voice warm with maternal pride. You must be excited about growing the firm. I am, he replied, though he didn't sound it. It's just, the terms are pretty aggressive. We'll be under a lot of pressure to perform. Well, dear, success often requires taking risks. Your father always said that fortune favors the bold. I know, Mom, you're right. It's just a big step. If only he knew how big. I have complete faith in you, Richard. You've always been such a smart boy. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth, and I spent the morning in my apartment, pacing between the window and the small dining table where I'd spread out copies of the loan documents. At 2 o'clock, James called to confirm that Richard and David Harrison had arrived at Wellington and Associates for the closing. Are you sure you don't want to be there? He asked. Barbara North should probably make an appearance. No, I said firmly. Let them sign without any distractions. I want this to be completely clean. For the next 3 hours, I sat by my phone, waiting for the call that would confirm my transformation from financial burden to financial puppeteer. At 5:17 p.m., James finally called. It's done, he said simply. They signed everything. $2.5 million has been transferred to Miller, Harrison, and Associates, secured by personal guarantees, property liens, and business assets. Congratulations, Dorothy. You now own your son's life. The words should have felt triumphant, but instead I was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd accomplished. In less than 6 weeks, I'd gone from being a discarded dependent to holding absolute power over the people who'd tried to dispose of me. How did they seem? I asked. Nervous but grateful, Richard actually thanked me for giving them the opportunity, said North Star Capital was saving their dreams. That evening, I had dinner in the Serenity Gardens dining room, making small talk with my table mates about the weather, the food, the upcoming holiday decorations. Mrs. Patterson from down the hall complained about her arthritis. Mr. Jameson discussed his grandson's college applications. Normal conversations among normal residents leading normal, powerless lives. But I was no longer normal or powerless. Hidden beneath my comfortable cardigan and sensible shoes was a woman who'd just executed one of the most sophisticated financial manipulations of her career. My son and daughter-in-law would wake up tomorrow believing they'd secured their future, never knowing they'd actually signed their independence away to the woman they'd planned to warehouse in a state facility. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Mom, got some great news about the firm today. Can't wait to tell you about it at Sunday brunch. I typed back, how wonderful, dear. I'm so proud of you. And I was proud, in a way that was complicated and dark and absolutely satisfying. Richard had gotten exactly what he'd asked for, a chance to expand his business and secure his family's future. The fact that he'd unknowingly mortgaged that future to his despised mother was simply the price of underestimating Dorothy Callahan. Sunday's brunch would be interesting. For the first time in 3 years, I would sit at their dining table not as a charity case or financial burden, but as the silent owner of everything they possessed. The transformation was complete. The financial burden had become their financial master. And the beautiful part was, they would never know until I decided to tell them. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear, and I prepared for brunch with the meticulous attention of an actress preparing for the performance of her lifetime. Every detail had to be perfect. The grateful smile of a dependent mother, the interested questions about Richard's success, the careful balance of pride and humility that would never suggest I knew more about their financial situation than they did. I arrived at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive at exactly 11 o'clock, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from the Serenity Gardens gift shop and wearing my most innocuous outfit, a lavender cardigan that Cassandra had once complimented and sensible flats that whispered harmless elderly woman. The irony of walking up to the front door of a house I now essentially owned was almost overwhelming. Bentley met me at the door with his usual enthusiasm, launching himself into my arms with the pure joy that only 6-year-olds possess. Nana, Dorothy. Dad got money for his work. Did he now? I said, hugging my grandson close and breathing in the scent of his shampoo. That sounds very exciting. Cassandra appeared behind him, and I was struck by how different she looked. The tension that had been written in every line of her body for weeks had evaporated, replaced by the kind of relaxed confidence that came from believing your problems were solved. She was practically glowing as she welcomed me inside, "Dorothy, you look lovely as always," she said, and for the first time in memory, her warmth seemed genuine rather than performed. "Richard's been dying to share his news with you." We settled in the living room, where Richard was pacing with barely contained excitement. He'd always been like this as a child, unable to sit still when he had good news to share. Watching him now, I felt a complex mixture of maternal affection and predatory satisfaction. "Mom," he began, settling into the chair across from me, "I wanted you to be the first family member to know. The firm's expansion has been approved. We're going to acquire Pemberton & Sons and double our practice size." "Oh, Richard, that's wonderful!" I exclaimed, letting genuine pride color my voice. "Tell me everything." For the next 20 minutes, he outlined their plans with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was describing his triumph rather than his trap. The new office space, the additional staff, the projected revenue increases. Cassandra chimed in with details about the celebration dinner they'd planned, the vacation to Bermuda they were considering, the private school applications they'd submitted for Bentley. "It sounds like a dream come true," I said, and meant it. Their dreams were coming true. They just didn't understand the price they'd pay for them. "The best part," Cassandra added, "is that we finally have some breathing room. No more worrying about cash flow or whether we can afford." She caught herself, probably remembering that one of their major expenses was sitting right in front of her. "Whether you can afford what, dear?" I asked innocently. "Oh, just the usual business concerns," Richard jumped in quickly. "You know how it is with a growing practice." But I could see what Cassandra had been about to say. No more worrying about whether they could afford my assisted living fees. No more discussions about state facilities or financial burdens. In their minds, the loan from North Star Capital had solved all their problems, including the Dorothy problem. During brunch, I played my part perfectly. I asked interested questions about their expansion plans, expressed appropriate concern about the risks of taking on debt, and shared gentle advice based on my limited understanding of business matters. Richard and Cassandra exchanged the kind of indulgent glances that said, "Isn't it sweet how Mom tries to understand our complicated financial world?" "The lender seems very professional," I commented while cutting my eggs Benedict. "What did you say the company name was?" "North Star Capital," Richard replied. "They specialize in high-growth investments. Very sophisticated operation." "And the terms are manageable?" I asked, because any caring mother would be concerned about her son taking on debt. "More than manageable," Cassandra said confidently. "Yes, the interest rate is higher than traditional bank loans, but the flexibility more than makes up for it. We can expand at our own pace without bureaucratic interference." I nodded approvingly while mentally calculating how quickly that confidence would evaporate when they realized what flexibility actually meant in their contract. The quarterly reporting requirements alone would give me visibility into every aspect of their financial lives. The revenue thresholds would let me apply pressure whenever I chose. And the personal guarantees meant that their beautiful house, their comfortable lifestyle, even Bentley's college fund would all be at risk if they failed to meet my expectations. "I'm so proud of both of you," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze Richard's hand. "Your father would be thrilled to see how successful you've become." "Thanks, Mom. That means everything to me." After brunch, while Cassandra loaded the dishwasher, Richard walked me to my car. It was one of those perfect autumn afternoons, with golden light filtering through the maple trees and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. "Mom," he said, leaning against the driver's side door, "I want you to know that this expansion means we'll be able to take better care of you. Maybe look into upgrading your accommodations at Serenity Gardens or even finding you somewhere nicer." The irony was so perfect I almost laughed out loud. "That's very thoughtful, dear, but I'm quite comfortable where I am." "Are you sure? I know the assisted living fees have been a strain, and now that we have more resources." "Richard, sweetheart, you've already done so much for me. I don't want to be any more of a burden than I already am." He flinched slightly at the word burden, and I felt a dark satisfaction at hitting that particular nerve. "You're not a burden, Mom, you're family, and family takes care of each other." "Yes," I said softly, getting into my car and rolling down the window. "Family does take care of each other." As I drove back to Serenity Gardens, I reflected on the morning's performance. Richard and Cassandra were celebrating their salvation, completely unaware that their savior was the woman they'd planned to discard. They would spend the next few months expanding their practice, renovating their offices, hiring new staff, all while paying 12% interest to the financial burden they'd tried to eliminate. But this was only the beginning. The real education would start when the first quarterly report was due, when they realized how much oversight Barbara North expected, when they understood that North Star Capital wasn't just a lender but a master. I pulled into the Serenity Gardens parking lot and sat for a moment, watching other residents return from their Sunday family visits. Most of them looked tired, probably from trying to convince their adult children that they were still capable, still valuable, still worth the expense of their care. Not me. I was no longer trying to convince anyone of my worth. I was about to prove it. 3 months into their new reality, the cracks began to show. It started with small things, changes so subtle that only someone watching as carefully as I was would notice them. Richard's voice carried a new strain during our weekly phone calls. Cassandra's smile seemed more brittle during Sunday brunches. The casual mentions of dinner parties and weekend getaways gradually disappeared from their conversation. The first quarterly report had been due in January, and according to James, it had taken Richard's accountant 3 attempts to provide documentation that met Barbara North's exacting standards. Every expense over $500 required justification. Every business decision needed to be explained in writing. Every client acquisition had to be documented with projected revenue streams. "They're starting to understand what they signed," James told me during one of our weekly check-ins. Richard called yesterday asking if there was any flexibility in the reporting requirements. And what did Barbara North tell him? That North Star Capital has fiduciary responsibilities to its investors and transparency is non-negotiable. He didn't sound happy. I smiled, imagining my successful attorney son being lectured about transparency by the woman he'd unknowingly dismissed as a financial burden. "How are their numbers looking?" "Problematic. The expansion is proceeding, but slower than projected. Client acquisition costs are higher than expected, and they're burning through cash faster than anticipated. If trends continue, they'll miss their revenue threshold by the end of Q2, which meant I could call the loan due immediately if I chose to. The power was intoxicating." But it was during a routine Sunday brunch in early February that I realized how deeply the stress was affecting them. Cassandra, who had always been meticulous about her appearance, looked tired. Her usually perfect makeup couldn't hide the shadows under her eyes, and her conversation was peppered with complaints about contractors, staff problems, and, quote, impossible clients. "The Pemberton acquisition is more complicated than we anticipated," Richard admitted when I asked about the expansion. "Integrating their client base with our systems has been challenging." "Challenging how?" I asked, playing the concerned mother. "Just normal growing pains," Cassandra said quickly, shooting Richard a warning look. "Nothing we can't handle." But I could see the tension between them, the way they communicated in glances and half-finished sentences. The fairy tale was starting to show its cracks. The breaking point came in March, when James called with news that made my chest tight with anticipation. "They've missed their Q1 revenue target by 18%, he reported. "According to the contract terms, that gives us grounds to demand immediate debt service modifications." "What kind of modifications?" "Higher interest rates, accelerated payment schedules, additional collateral requirements. Or we could simply call the loan due in full." I sat in my apartment, looking out at the Serenity Gardens courtyard where other residents were enjoying the early spring sunshine. Mrs. Patterson was feeding birds from her wheelchair. Mr. Jameson was reading a newspaper on his favorite bench. Normal people living normal, powerless lives. "Set up a meeting," I said finally. "Barbara North needs to discuss their performance issues in person." The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at Richard's office, the same conference room where I'd first presented myself as their financial savior. This time, however, the atmosphere was very different. David Harrison looked like he'd aged 5 years and 3 months, and Richard's professional composure was fraying at the edges. "Ms. North," Richard said as I entered, his handshake less confident than I remembered. "Thank you for meeting with us." "Mr. Miller, Mr. Harrison." I settled into my chair with the authority of someone who held all the cards. I've reviewed your Q1 performance reports, and frankly, I'm concerned. We know the numbers aren't where we projected, David began, his voice defensive. But the integration process always takes longer than… Mr. Harrison, I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. North Star Capital didn't invest $2.5 million to hear explanations about why you're failing to meet your obligations. We invested based on specific performance metrics that you assured us were achievable. Richard leaned forward. Ms. North, we're confident that Q2 will show significant improvement. The Pemberton clients are starting to integrate, and we have several major cases coming to settlement. Confidence doesn't pay interest, Mr. Miller. Results do. I opened my folder and placed a document on the table between us. These are your options going forward. They read in silence, and I watched their faces pale as they absorbed the implications. Option 1. Immediate payment of $400,000 to bring the loan current, plus increased monthly payments and additional personal guarantees. Option 2. Transfer of additional collateral, including Cassandra's jewelry collection and Richard's vintage car collection. Option 3. Full loan acceleration with payment due in 60 days. These terms are… David's voice trailed off. Harsh, I suggested. Mr. Harrison, you signed a contract with specific performance requirements. North Star Capital has been more than patient with your shortfalls, but our investors expect results. We need time, Richard said, his lawyer's training kicking in. Surely we can negotiate a modification that works for both parties. Time is the one thing you don't have, Mr. Miller. Your contract gives you 30 days to cure any default. After that, we can proceed with asset seizure. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I could see Richard calculating, trying to find a way out of the trap he'd walked into so willingly. What about our families? David asked quietly. If you foreclose on our homes… That should have been a consideration before you failed to meet your obligations, I replied without a hint of sympathy. North Star Capital is not in the business of protecting your families from the consequences of your poor performance. I let them stew in silence for a moment, watching my son, my own flesh and blood, contemplate the destruction of everything he'd built. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But the larger part, the part that remembered sitting in their kitchen listening to them discuss my disposal, felt nothing but cold satisfaction. There is one possibility, I said finally, and both men looked up with desperate hope. North Star Capital occasionally considers bringing underperforming investments under direct management. We would assume operational control of the firm while you remain as junior partners, working to restore profitability under our guidance. What would that mean exactly? Richard asked. It would mean that every business decision, every expenditure, every client interaction would require approval from North Star Capital's management team. You would essentially become employees in your own firm. The humiliation was complete. I was offering to let them keep their jobs while I controlled their lives, and they would have to be grateful for the privilege. Richard and David exchanged a long look, the kind of wordless communication that comes from years of partnership and shared desperation. We'll need to discuss this, Richard said finally. Of course, you have until Monday morning to decide. After that, we proceed with foreclosure. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave, Richard stood and offered his hand one final time. Ms. North, I want you to know that we appreciate North Star's patience with our situation. Mr. Miller, I replied, meeting his eyes directly. Business is business. Personal feelings have no place in investment decisions. Walking out of that office, I felt the full weight of what I'd accomplished. In 6 months, I'd gone from being a discarded financial burden to holding absolute power over the people who'd tried to dispose of me. The victory was complete. Now came the most delicious part, watching them accept their new reality while still believing I was just a helpless old woman in an assisted living facility. The call came on Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, just as I was finishing my breakfast in the Serenity Gardens dining room. Richard's voice was hollow, defeated in a way I'd never heard before, not even when his father died. Ms. North, this is Richard Miller. We've made our decision. I excused myself from the table where Mrs. Patterson and I had been discussing the weather and walked to a quiet corner of the lobby. Around me, the normal rhythms of assisted living continued. Nurses making their rounds, residents shuffling to morning activities, the gentle hum of a world where nothing particularly important ever happened. "Mr. Miller," I said, slipping effortlessly into Barbara North's crisp, professional tone, "I'm listening. We accept your proposal for direct management. North Star Capital can assume operational control of Miller, Harrison, and Associates, effective immediately." The words should have felt like victory, but instead I experienced something more complex, a mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and an emotion I couldn't quite name. My son had just surrendered his independence to save his family, never knowing he was surrendering it to his own mother. "That's a wise decision, Mr. Miller. I'll have the management transition documents prepared by Wednesday. In the meantime, please ensure that all financial records, client files, and business operations manuals are ready for our review team." "Of course. Ms. North, I want you to know that David and I are committed to making this work. We won't let North Star Capital down again." "I'm sure you won't, Mr. Miller. I'm sure you won't." After I hung up, I sat in the lobby for a long time, watching the morning activities swirl around me. The victory was complete, but it tasted different than I'd expected. Not bitter, exactly, but complicated in ways I hadn't anticipated. That evening, James called to congratulate me. "Dorothy, you've pulled off one of the most sophisticated financial revenge schemes I've ever witnessed. Miller, Harrison and Associates is now essentially a subsidiary of North Star Capital, which means it's entirely under your control." "Yes," I said simply. "You don't sound as excited as I expected." I walked to my apartment window and looked out at the garden paths where residents took their evening walks. "James, what happens now?" Now you decide how you want to play this. You could keep them under your thumb indefinitely, micromanaging every aspect of their business and personal lives. You could gradually reveal your identity, letting them slowly realize who's been controlling their fate. Or, he paused, or you could teach them the lesson and then offer them a path to redemption. It's entirely up to you. The next few weeks established a new rhythm. As Barbara North, I implemented strict oversight protocols for the law firm. Every expenditure over $200 required approval. Weekly performance reports were mandatory. Client acquisition strategies had to be submitted for review. Richard and David found themselves running every decision past their mysterious benefactor. Their independence completely evaporated. Meanwhile, as Dorothy Callahan, I continued my regular routine at Serenity Gardens. The contrast was almost surreal. Mornings spent approving or rejecting my son's business decisions. Evenings spent listening to him complain about his demanding new business partner during our phone calls. "The North Star people are impossibly controlling," he vented during one particularly stressful conversation. "They want reports on everything. Yesterday, I had to get approval to buy new office chairs." "That does sound frustrating, dear," I replied, having personally rejected his request for Herman Miller chairs in favor of more economical alternatives. "But I suppose they want to protect their investment." "I guess it's just, I built this firm from nothing, Mom, and now I feel like an employee in my own business." The pain in his voice was real, and I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. This was my son, the boy I'd raised to be strong and independent, now reduced to seeking approval for the most basic business decisions. But then I remembered Cassandra's voice. "Your mother is becoming a financial burden we can't afford anymore." I remembered the casual discussion of state facilities, and the dismissive phrase, "just existing." The sympathy hardened into resolve. The revelation came in May, during what would become the most memorable Sunday brunch of our lives. I arrived at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive to find Richard and Cassandra in the midst of a heated discussion about household expenses. The stress of the past few months had taken its toll. Their perfect home showed subtle signs of strain, from the slightly overgrown lawn to the delayed maintenance that spoke of a tightened budget. "We can't afford to renovate the guest bathroom right now," Richard was saying as I walked in. "Every discretionary expense has to go through North Star approval, and they're not exactly generous with home improvement requests." "It's becoming embarrassing," Cassandra replied, her voice sharp with frustration. "The Hendersons' party last week. I could barely hold my head up when they were showing off their new kitchen." Bentley, now 7 and more perceptive than his parents realized, looked up from his coloring book. Why is everyone always talking about money? The innocent question hung in the air, and I realized that my revenge had claimed an unintended victim. My grandson was living in a house filled with tension and financial anxiety, his parents' stress bleeding into his young world. Adults sometimes worry about money, sweetheart, I said, kneeling down to his level. It's not something you need to worry about. But Daddy's always angry now, Bentley said with devastating honesty, and Mommy cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking. The words hit me like a physical blow. In my quest to teach Richard and Cassandra a lesson about respecting their elders, I'd created a home environment that was damaging my innocent grandson. That afternoon, after Bentley had gone outside to play and Cassandra was in the kitchen, I found myself alone with Richard in his study. He was hunched over financial statements, the weight of his reduced circumstances written in every line of his body. "Richard," I said softly, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." He looked up, and I was shocked by how much he'd aged in the past few months. "What is it, Mom?" "Do you regret the conversation you and Cassandra had about me last fall, the one about assisted living costs and finding more affordable arrangements?" His face went pale. "Mom, I don't know what you—" "I heard you, Richard. I was in the kitchen doorway when Cassandra called me a financial burden you couldn't afford anymore. When you discussed moving me to a state facility so you could afford a house in Aspen." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face cycled through shock, embarrassment, and finally shame. "Mom, we never meant, it wasn't supposed to be." He stopped, unable to find words that could excuse the inexcusable. "It's all right, dear," I said gently. "I understand that caring for an aging parent is expensive. I understand that my needs created financial pressure for your family." "No, Mom, that's not. We should never have discussed it that way. You deserved better from us." I reached into my purse and pulled out a business card, not Barbara North's, but one I'd had made specially for this moment. It read Dorothy Callahan, Senior Partner, North Star Capital Solutions. Richard stared at the card for a long moment, his eyes moving from my name to the company logo he'd seen on dozens of documents over the past months. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Your financial burden, Richard, has been your financial salvation for the past 6 months. Every approval you've sought, every report you've submitted, every business decision you've had to justify, all of it has been going to me." The realization dawned slowly, like sunrise breaking over a landscape he'd never seen before. You're Barbara North? I'm Dorothy Callahan, the woman who gave up her own financial security to ensure you had every advantage in life. The woman who liquidated her retirement savings to pay for your education. The woman you and your wife decided was too expensive to keep around." Richard stood up slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. "The loan, the management takeover, that was all you? Every penny of it. The money you borrowed to expand your firm? That was my money, Richard. The Cloud Vault investment I made years ago and forgot about until you and Cassandra reminded me that I was just existing." "Oh God," he whispered, sinking back into his chair. "Mom, what have we done?" "You've learned a very expensive lesson about the value of family," I replied. "And now you get to decide what you want to do with that knowledge." I pulled out a second folder, one containing loan forgiveness documents that James had prepared weeks ago. "Your debt to North Star Capital can be forgiven, Richard. Your firm's independence can be restored. Your home can be free and clear. All of it. What's the catch?" "No catch, just a choice. You can go back to being the successful attorney with the perfect wife and the beautiful house, free from the financial burden of caring for your aging mother. Or you can remember that family means more than money, and that the people who love you deserve better than to be discarded when they become inconvenient." Richard stared at the documents, then at me, then at the photos on his desk. Pictures of our family through the years, including several of him as a child, hugging me with pure, uncomplicated love. "Mom," he said finally, his voice breaking, "I am so sorry. We are so sorry. What we said, what we planned. There's no excuse for it." "No," I agreed. "There isn't. But there can be forgiveness." I signed the loan forgiveness papers and placed them on his desk. "Your debt is forgiven, Richard. But more importantly, mine is too. I forgive you for forgetting that your financial burden used to change your diapers and sing you lullabies. I forgive Cassandra for not understanding that love isn't a business transaction. And I forgive myself for letting my hurt turn into something so elaborate and manipulative. Richard was crying now, and I moved around the desk to hold him the way I had when he was a child, and the world seemed too big and complicated to handle. I don't deserve this, he whispered. None of us deserve the love we receive, Richard. We just try to be worthy of it. That evening, we had a different kind of family dinner. Cassandra cried when Richard told her the truth. Bentley didn't understand the financial complexities, but he seemed to sense that the tension in his house had finally broken. Are you going to live with us now, Nana Dorothy? He asked over dessert. No, sweetheart, I replied, ruffling his hair. I like my apartment at Serenity Gardens, but I'll visit more often, and you can visit me too. And we don't have to worry about money anymore? We'll always have to be careful with money, Bentley, but we don't have to worry about it taking away the people we love. 6 months later, I moved out of Serenity Gardens and into a beautiful condominium overlooking the harbor, purchased with my own money, maintained with my own resources, chosen according to my own preferences. Richard and Cassandra visit every Sunday now, and Bentley has his own room for sleepovers. The law firm is thriving under Richard's restored leadership, free from the crushing debt that had nearly destroyed it. Cassandra has returned to school to finish the degree she'd abandoned years ago. They're building a life based on their own capabilities rather than borrowed money and borrowed time. As for me, I'm no longer anyone's financial burden. I'm Dorothy Callahan, a woman who learned that the most powerful revenge is teaching people to be better than they were. And sometimes, late at night in my Harborview apartment, I smile remembering the day my son's wife called me a financial burden.
She had no idea how right she was. Or how wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.